The bastard the father never claimed, but his last wish made them all bow before her.
You don't exist!
The mahogany doors of the Moore estate swung open with a sound like a coffin lid lifting. Inside, gathered around the marble table in the reading room, sat a family dressed in black, not mourning but waiting for what they believed was rightfully theirs. Beatrice Moore, draped in Chanel and cold fury, sat at the head. Her children flanked her like soldiers: Marcus, the golden son with hollow eyes, and Vanessa, the daughter who wore cruelty like diamonds. The lawyer cleared his throat. His hands trembled as he unfolded the will. "Before any distribution can be made," he said slowly, "there is a condition, written in Mr. Moore's own hand." Beatrice's jaw tightened. "What condition?" "Elena Moore must be found. She must be present. Nothing will be divided until she signs." The room went silent. That name, that ghost, that secret they thought had been buried with shame 30 years ago. And then from the doorway a voice cut through the silence like broken glass. "I'm already here." Elena Moore had learned early that some people are born into love and others are born into debt. Her mother, Clara, had been a housekeeper at the Moore estate. Beautiful, kind, and invisible to everyone except Richard Moore. He saw her. He wanted her. And when she became pregnant, he hid her like evidence. Clara died when Elena was 7. Pneumonia, they said. Exhaustion, the truth whispered. Richard never came to the funeral. Elena was raised in a small apartment on the edge of town, supported by monthly checks that came with no signature, no note, no acknowledgement. She was a line item in a secret ledger. When she turned 10, Beatrice found out. The legitimate wife arrived one grey morning with 2 security guards. She stood in the doorway of Elena's tiny room and looked at her the way one looks at a stain. "You don't exist," Beatrice said coldly. "And if you ever come near my family again, I'll make sure you disappear completely." Elena never forgot those words. She grew up in the shadows, built her own life with her own hands, and learned that silence could be armor. But silence, she would discover, could also be a weapon. Elena had been 10 years old the day they came for her. She remembered waking to the sound of a car engine purring outside her bedroom window. Not the usual rattling sedans that filled their neighborhood, but something smooth and expensive. She pressed her face to the glass and saw a black Mercedes parked in front of their building, sleek and predatory. Her grandmother was in the kitchen, humming while she made oatmeal. Elena's stomach twisted with a feeling she couldn't name yet. Fear, maybe, or the instinct that something was about to end. The knock came 3 minutes later, firm, final. Her grandmother opened the door, and Beatrice Moore stepped inside like she owned the air itself. She was tall, elegant, untouchable. Her hair was swept into a perfect chignon. Her coat was wool, cream-colored, expensive. She smelled like roses and venom. Behind her stood 2 men in dark suits. One had a briefcase, the other had the posture of someone who knew how to hurt people quietly. "Mrs. Santos," Beatrice said, her voice like crystal shattering slowly. "We need to talk." Elena's grandmother straightened, though her hands shook. "About what?" "About the girl." Elena stood frozen in the hallway, her small hands gripping the doorframe. Beatrice's eyes slid to her. Cold, calculating, disgusted. "She looks like him," Beatrice said quietly, almost to herself. Then louder, "That ends today." "You can't," her grandmother began. "I can." Beatrice stepped forward. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do?" Her grandmother said nothing. Beatrice smiled, thin and sharp. "Your daughter worked in my house. She was paid well, very well. And then she seduced my husband. That's not—" "I don't care what you think happened." Beatrice's voice dropped to a whisper, deadly. "What matters is this. That girl is a mistake, a stain on my family's name, and I will not allow her to exist near us." The man with the briefcase opened it. Inside were stacks of paper, legal documents, contracts. "You'll sign these," Beatrice continued. "They state that you will never contact Richard Moore, never speak his name in connection with the child, and never come within 500 feet of any Moore property. In return, the monthly payments will continue. Enough to live, not enough to rise." Her grandmother's face crumpled. "She's just a child. She's his daughter. She's nothing." Beatrice's voice could have frozen oceans. "And if you fight me, I will make sure you lose everything. Your apartment, your job, your dignity. I will make you disappear." Elena felt something crack inside her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but she was 10. and the world had just taught her that she had no power. Her grandmother signed the papers with trembling hands. Beatrice looked at Elena one last time before leaving. She crouched down, her perfume suffocating, and whispered, "You don't exist. Remember that." Then she was gone. Elena stood in the silence that followed, her small body shaking, her mind trying to make sense of the injustice. Her grandmother collapsed into a chair and wept. Elena didn't cry. Not then. Not for years. She buried the pain so deep it became part of her bones. That night, Elena sat at the window and stared at the city lights. Somewhere out there was a mansion she'd never see, a father who'd never claim her, siblings who didn't know she existed. She made a promise to herself. She would survive. She would build something. She would become someone, not for him, not for them, for the little girl who'd been told she was nothing. Years passed. Elena grew up in modest apartments, attended public schools, worked part-time jobs to help her grandmother. The monthly checks kept coming, anonymous and cold. Blood money, her grandmother called them. Elena never touched them if she could help it. She studied hard, earned scholarships, went to community college, then transferred to a state university. She became a social worker, helping children in broken systems, children who reminded her of herself. She never used the name Moore. She never spoke of her father. She built a life on her own terms, forged in silence and defiance. But some ghosts don't stay buried. When her grandmother died, Elena found a box hidden in the closet. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters her mother had written to Richard Moore, begging him to acknowledge their daughter. Letters that had never been sent, and one letter that had been returned, unopened, with a single word stamped across the envelope: refused. Elena sat on the floor of the empty apartment and read every word her mother had written, words full of love, desperation, hope, words that had been thrown away like trash. She felt the anger rise hot and sharp, but she didn't cry. She folded the letters carefully, placed them back in the box and locked it away. She told herself she didn't care. She told herself she'd moved on. But the wound had never healed. It had only scarred over, waiting. Richard Moore died on a Tuesday in November, during a board meeting. The news called it a heart attack. Swift, painless, poetic almost, for a man who'd spent his life avoiding consequences. Elena heard about it 3 days later, from a former colleague who saw the obituary. "Wasn't your father's name Richard Moore?" the colleague asked casually over coffee. Elena's hand froze on her cup. "What? There's an obituary. Big one. Billionaire philanthropist. Built half the city, blah, blah, blah. I remembered you mentioned—" "I didn't," Elena said quickly. Too quickly. Her colleague raised an eyebrow but didn't push. Elena left the coffee shop and sat in her car for 20 minutes, staring at nothing. He was dead. The man who'd refused her, hidden her, paid to keep her silent. She felt nothing, a hollow space where rage should have been. She drove home, poured herself a glass of wine and opened her laptop. The obituary was everything she expected. Glowing, sanitized, full of lies. Richard Moore, 68, beloved husband and father, visionary entrepreneur, generous philanthropist, beloved husband, father. She almost laughed. The article mentioned his wife, Beatrice, his children, Marcus and Vanessa, his business empire, his charitable foundations. It mentioned everything except the truth. There was no mention of Clara Santos, no mention of the housekeeper he'd seduced and abandoned, no mention of the daughter he'd erased. Elena closed the laptop and sat in the dark. She told herself she didn't care. But the wound had reopened, bleeding again after all these years. The funeral was held at the Cathedral of St. Thomas, the kind of cathedral where politicians and CEOs got eulogized like saints. Elena didn't go. She watched clips of it online instead, sitting in her small apartment with the curtains drawn. Beatrice stood at the front, draped in black Valentino, her face a mask of dignified grief. Marcus gave a speech about legacy and vision, his voice smooth and practiced. Vanessa wept beautifully into a silk handkerchief. The cameras loved them. Elena felt sick. These people had everything. The name, the money, the public love, and they'd stolen it by erasing her. She closed her laptop and poured another glass of wine. A week later, the letter arrived. It came in a cream-colored envelope, thick and expensive, with a law firm's return address embossed in gold. Whitmore and Associates Estate Planning and Probate Law. Elena stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a formal letter, written in precise legal language. "Dear Ms. Santos, you are hereby notified that you have been named in the last will and testament of Richard Andrew Moore, deceased. Your presence is required at the reading of the will, scheduled for November 28th at 10:00 a.m. at the Moore estate. Failure to attend may result in forfeiture of any claims or interests in the estate. Sincerely, Jonathan Whitmore. Escans Elena read it 3 times. Named in the will, her presence required. After 30 years of silence, after decades of being erased, suddenly she mattered, not because he'd loved her, but because he'd died. She wanted to burn the letter, to throw it away, to tell them to go to hell, but something stopped her. Curiosity, anger, a need to see their faces when they realized the ghost had returned. She called the law firm the next morning. "I'll be there," she said simply. The receptionist sounded surprised. "Oh, good. We'll inform the family." Eleanor hung up and stared at herself in the mirror. The bastard the father never claimed was going home. The Moore estate sat on 12 acres of manicured perfection, a monument to wealth and the cruelty required to maintain it. Eleanor stood outside the iron gates on the morning of the reading, her heart pounding against her ribs. She'd worn simple clothes, black slacks, a grey blouse, no jewelry. She refused to perform for them. The intercom buzzed. A voice crackled through, cold and professional. "Name, Elena Santos." A pause. Then, "Come in." The gates swung open with a low, mechanical hum. Elena walked up the long driveway, past sculpted hedges and marble fountains, toward the house she'd been expelled from as a child. It looked exactly as she remembered. Cold, beautiful, unwelcoming. The front door opened before she reached it. A butler, or maybe a lawyer's assistant, stood waiting, his face carefully neutral. "This way, please." He led her through hallways lined with oil paintings and antique furniture, past rooms that smelled of old money and older secrets. They stopped at a set of double doors. The butler knocked once, then opened them. Inside was a room that looked like a courtroom. Dark wood paneling, high ceilings, a long table surrounded by chairs, and sitting at that table, dressed in black like a murder of crows, was the Moore family. Beatrice sat at the head, her spine rigid, her hands folded primly. Marcus sat to her right, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. Vanessa sat to her left, looking at Elena with barely concealed disgust. At the far end sat Jonathan Whitmore, the lawyer, a thin man with silver hair and tired eyes. They all turned when Elena entered. The room went silent. Beatrice's face drained of color. For just a moment her mask slipped, and Elena saw something raw beneath it. Shock, rage, fear. "You," Beatrice whispered. Elena met her gaze and didn't flinch. "Me." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "What the hell is she doing here?" Whitmore cleared his throat. "Mr. Moore, please sit down." "She has no right." "She has every right," Whitmore said firmly. "Per your father's will." Marcus looked at his mother. Beatrice's hands were trembling. "Sit down, Marcus," she said quietly. He sat, but his eyes never left Elena. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dripping with venom. "After all these years, you actually have the audacity to show up here." Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat. "I was invited." "Invited?" Vanessa laughed, bitter and sharp. "You're a mistake, a nobody. You don't belong." "Enough." Whitmore's voice cut through the room like a gavel. "We're here to execute the wishes of Richard Moore. All of you will conduct yourselves accordingly." He opened a leather folder and pulled out a thick document. "This is the last will and testament of Richard Andrew Moore, executed on October 14th of this year, 1 month before his death. 1 month. He'd known he was dying." Whitmore adjusted his glasses and began to read. The first part was standard. Funeral arrangements, charitable donations, minor bequests. Then came the assets. "To my wife, Beatrice Moore, I leave the family home and an annual trust fund of $2 million. Beatrice's face remained stone. "To my son, Marcus Moore, I leave controlling interest in Moore Industries." Marcus exhaled slowly, relief flickering across his features. "To my daughter, Vanessa Moore, I leave the property portfolio and a trust fund of $5 million. Vanessa smiled, smug and satisfied. Elena waited. She expected nothing. She'd been erased her entire life. Why would death change that? But Whitmore wasn't finished. He turned a page, his expression unreadable, and his voice dropped. "However, all distributions are contingent upon the following condition, written by Mr. Moore in his own hand and witnessed by myself and 2 notaries." He pulled out a separate sheet of paper. Cream-colored, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. Whitmore read aloud, "Nothing shall be distributed. No asset shall be transferred. No trust shall be activated until my daughter Elena Santos is found, brought to this house and given the acknowledgement I denied her in life." The room erupted. Marcus slammed his fist on the table. "This is insane!" Vanessa's face twisted with rage. "He can't do this!" Beatrice said nothing. She stared at the paper like it was a ghost. Whitmore raised his voice. "There's more." The room fell silent again. He continued reading. "Eleanor will be given full access to my personal files, my letters, and my private accounts. She will be allowed to speak. She will be heard. And only after she chooses of her own free will to forgive or condemn me, will the rest of you receive what you believe you're owed." Whitmore set the paper down. "In short," he said quietly, "Elena Santos holds the key to everything. Nothing moves without her consent." Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room. Beatrice's mask finally cracked. "You did this," she hissed. "You poisoned his mind." "I've never spoken to him," Elena said calmly. "Not once in 30 years. Liar." "Enough." Whitmore stood. "The will is legal. It's binding, and it will be executed. Miss Santos, you have the right to review all documents pertaining to your father's estate, and you have the right to take as much time as you need." Eleanor stood slowly. She looked at Beatrice, at Marcus, at Vanessa. "I'll take a week," she said. "A week?" Marcus exploded. "1 week," Eleanor repeated. "And then I'll decide." She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, Vanessa's voice rang out sharp and cruel. "You think you've won? You think this changes anything? You're still nothing. You'll always be nothing." Elena paused at the door, her hand on the frame. She looked back, her voice steady. "Maybe. But right now, I'm the only thing standing between you and everything you want." She walked out. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click. The Moore family had spent decades pretending Elena didn't exist. Now they couldn't stop thinking about her. Marcus sat in his father's old office, staring at the mahogany desk where Richard Moore had built an empire. The room still smelled like his cologne, sharp, expensive, suffocating. He'd always thought this would feel different, triumphant, earned. Instead, it felt like standing in a tomb. His phone buzzed. Vanessa's name flashed on the screen. "Did you talk to Whitmore?" she demanded without preamble. "He won't budge," Marcus said, rubbing his temples. "The will is airtight. Father made sure of it. Then we make her budge." "How exactly?" "Offer her money. Everyone has a price." Marcus laughed bitterly. "You think she came here for money? She could have shown up years ago if she wanted a payout. Then what does she want?" That was the question Marcus couldn't answer. He'd spent the last 3 days digging into Elena Santos's life, hiring a private investigator to uncover leverage. What he found was nothing. No scandals, no debts, no skeletons. Elena worked as a social worker in a modest non-profit, lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, drove a 10-year-old Honda. She volunteered at shelters on weekends. She had a small circle of friends. No romantic entanglements, no criminal record. She was clean. Worse, she was good. The investigator's report had included a quote from one of her colleagues. "Elena's the kind of person who'll give you her last dollar and convince you she didn't need it anyway." Marcus had thrown the report across the room. "How do you fight someone who doesn't want anything?" "We wait," he told Vanessa. "She said 1 week. We give her 1 week, and then we make our move. And if she says no," Marcus's jaw tightened, "she won't." He hung up and stared at the portrait of his father hanging above the fireplace. Richard Moore looked down at him, stern and unyielding, the same expression he'd worn in life. "Why did you do this?" Marcus whispered. The portrait offered no answers. Beatrice Moore had not slept in 3 days. She sat in her private study, surrounded by photo albums and legal documents, trying to piece together the narrative she'd constructed so carefully over the years. The narrative where Richard had been faithful, where their family had been perfect, where Elena Santos didn't exist. But that narrative had always been a lie. She'd known about Clara from the beginning. Known and chosen to ignore it. Richard had been reckless, entitled, convinced his wealth made him untouchable. When Clara got pregnant, he'd panicked. Beatrice had offered him a solution: hide the girl, pay her off, erase her. And Richard had agreed. At the time, Beatrice had told herself she was protecting her family, protecting her children from scandal, protecting the Moore name. But the truth, the one she'd buried deep, was simpler and uglier. She'd been protecting her pride. She couldn't bear the idea of her husband's mistress bearing his child, couldn't bear the humiliation. So she'd erased Elena, not for her children's sake, but for her own. And now, that ghost had returned. Beatrice opened a drawer and pulled out an old photograph. It was from years ago, taken before Elena was born. Richard and Clara standing in the garden behind the estate. Richard was laughing, his hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara was looking up at him with soft, adoring eyes. Beatrice had found the photo hidden in Richard's desk after Clara died. She'd meant to burn it, but she'd kept it. A reminder, a punishment. She stared at Clara's face now, at her gentle smile, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in decades. Guilt. She'd destroyed that woman, worked her to exhaustion, isolated her, made her invisible. And when Clara died, Beatrice had felt nothing but relief. But looking at the photo now, Beatrice saw something she'd refused to see before. Clara had loved Richard, genuinely, desperately, and Richard had loved her back. Not Beatrice, not the mother of his legitimate children. Clara, the housekeeper, the nobody. Beatrice crumpled the photo in her fist. She'd spent her entire marriage competing with a ghost, and now the ghost's daughter had come to collect. Vanessa Moore stood in front of her bedroom mirror, rehearsing. "Elena," she said aloud, her voice dripping with false warmth. "I know we got off on the wrong foot, but we're family, right? We should stick together." She grimaced. "Too fake." "Elena, listen, I get it. Dad was a bastard, but taking it out on us won't change anything. Better, more honest." She sighed and sat on the edge of her bed. The truth was, Vanessa didn't know what to feel. She'd grown up hearing whispers about the other woman and the girl, but her mother had trained her never to acknowledge them, to pretend they didn't exist. Vanessa had been good at pretending, but now Elena was real, solid, undeniable, and Vanessa hated her for it. Not because of the inheritance, not because of the will, but because Elena's existence proved something Vanessa had always feared. Their family was rotten, built on lies, cruelty, and erasure. Vanessa had spent her whole life performing perfection. Perfect daughter, perfect socialite, perfect heiress. She'd ignored the cracks in the foundation, the whispers at galas, the way her father looked through her instead of at her. Elena's return shattered the illusion, and Vanessa didn't know how to exist without it. She picked up her phone and scrolled through Elena's sparse social media presence. A few photos. Elena at a community garden, Elena with kids at a shelter, Elena laughing with friends at a modest restaurant. She looked happy, not rich, not powerful, but happy. Vanessa felt something twist in her chest. Envy. She threw the phone across the room. Jonathan Whitmore sat in his car outside the Moore estate, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He'd been Richard Moore's lawyer for 20 years. He'd drafted contracts, negotiated deals, buried scandals, but this will, Richard's final act, had surprised even him. 2 months before his death, Richard had called Whitmore to his study. His health was failing. The doctors had given him 6 months at most. "I need to fix something," Richard had said, his voice hoarse. Whitmore had expected instructions about the business, maybe a charitable bequest. Instead, Richard handed him a letter. "I want you to find her. Elena, my daughter." Whitmore had stared. "Mr. Moore, I know what I did," Richard interrupted. "I know what I let Beatrice do, and I can't die with that on my conscience." "Why now?" Richard had looked at him with hollow eyes. "Because I'm out of time." He dictated the terms of the will himself, insisted that nothing be distributed until Elena was found and acknowledged. "She deserves to be seen," Richard had said quietly, "even if it's too late." Whitmore had tried to argue. "This will destroy your family." "My family's already destroyed," Richard replied. "I just hid it better." Now, sitting outside the estate, Whitmore wondered if Richard had done the right thing, or if he'd just traded one cruelty for another. He sighed and started the car. Justice, he thought, was often indistinguishable from revenge. Elena spent the first 2 days after the will reading in her apartment, staring at the walls and trying to process the impossibility of her situation. She held the key to an empire she'd never wanted. She had power over people who'd spent decades pretending she didn't exist, and she had no idea what to do with it. On the 3rd day, Jonathan Whitmore called. "Ms. Santos, I need to provide you with access to your father's personal files, as stipulated in the will." "What kind of files?" "Letters, financial records, personal journals, everything he left for you." Eleanor's stomach twisted. "Why would I want to read his journals?" "Because," Whitmore said gently, "he wanted you to understand." "Understand what?" "Why he did what he did, and why, at the end, he tried to fix it." Elena was silent for a long moment. When? She finally asked. Whenever you're ready. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The Moore estate felt different in daylight. Less like a fortress, more like a mausoleum. Whitmore met her at the door and led her upstairs, to a room she'd never seen before. Richard Moore's private study. It was smaller than she expected, intimate almost, lined with bookshelves, a single desk by the window, a leather chair worn soft with use. On the desk sat 3 boxes. Everything's here, Whitmore said. I'll leave you alone. Wait. Elena turned to him. Did you know? About me? Whitmore hesitated. Not at first. Your father was very good at keeping secrets. But eventually? Yes, eventually I knew. And you helped him hide me? It wasn't a question. Whitmore's face creased with something like shame. I did what my client asked. I'm not proud of it. Did he ever ask about me? Whitmore met her gaze. Every year on your birthday he'd call me. Ask if you were okay, if you needed anything. Elena's breath caught. He never stopped the payments, Whitmore continued. Even when Beatrice demanded he cut you off, he set up a separate account. Made sure you'd never go without. But he never came, Elena said, her voice breaking. He never acknowledged me. No, he didn't. Whitmore left. Elena stood alone in the study, surrounded by the remnants of a man she'd never known. Slowly, she opened the first box. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Letters from her mother, Clara. Letters Elena had never seen. Letters that had been hidden away, locked in this room for decades. She picked up the first one, dated 3 months before Elena was born. Richard, I felt her kick today. Our daughter. She's strong. I think she'll have your determination. I know this is complicated. I know you have a family, responsibilities. I'm not asking you to leave them. I'm just asking you to love her when she comes. Please, just love her. Clara Elena's hands shook. She read another and another. Her mother's voice preserved in ink, pleading and hoping and breaking slowly over years of silence. The letters stopped a month before Clara died. The last one was different. Shorter, resigned. Richard, I'm tired. I don't think I'll get better this time. I'm not angry anymore. I chose this. I knew what I was getting into. But Elena didn't choose it. She's innocent. She's good. Please, don't let her think she was a mistake. Clara. Elena set the letter down and pressed her hands to her face. She didn't cry. She couldn't. The pain was too old, too deep. It had calcified into something harder than tears. She opened the second box. Inside were journals. 5 of them, leather-bound and worn. She opened the first one randomly, somewhere in the middle. Richard's handwriting was sharp, angular, impatient. March 14th, 1998. Beatrice found another photograph today. Clara and Elena at the park. I don't know how she keeps finding them. She threatened to leave, to take the children, to destroy me publicly. So I agreed. No more contact, no more visits. Elena will be provided for, but from a distance. It's the right decision, the smart decision. So why do I feel like I'm drowning? Elena flipped ahead. July 22nd, 2003. Elena's 18 today. I saw her at her high school graduation. I sat in the back. She didn't see me. She gave a speech. Something about resilience, about building yourself when the world tries to tear you down. She's extraordinary, and I had nothing to do with it. Clara would be proud. Elena's vision blurred. She kept reading. October 14th, 2025. The doctors say I have months, weeks maybe. I've built an empire. I've provided for my family. I've done everything a man is supposed to do. And I've failed the only person who ever deserved better from me. I can't fix what I've done, but I can force them to see her, to acknowledge her, to give her what I never did, the truth. The journal ended there. Elena closed it slowly. She sat in the silence of her father's study, surrounded by his words, his guilt, his too-late regret, and she felt nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just emptiness. The third box contained financial records, account statements, wire transfers, receipts. Elena scanned them, her brow furrowing. The monthly payments she'd received her entire life, the ones her grandmother had called blood money, had come from Richard's personal account. But there were other payments, larger ones. Tuition payments to her college, rent payments when her grandmother got sick, medical bills, car repairs, emergency funds, all anonymous, all untraceable, until now. Her father had been watching, helping. From a distance, in secret, he'd been there. Not enough, not nearly enough, but there. Elena sat back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. Why? she whispered to the empty room. Why couldn't you just be there? The room offered no answers, but as she sat there, surrounded by the evidence of a man who'd loved her from the shadows and hated himself for it, Elena realized something. She wasn't here for him. She was here for herself, and for every person who'd ever been erased, hidden, told they didn't matter. She stood, gathered the boxes, and walked out of the study. Downstairs, the Moore family was waiting. It was time to make them listen. Elena found them in the drawing room, arranged like pieces on a chessboard. Beatrice sat by the fireplace, a crystal glass of scotch in her hand. Marcus stood by the window, his shoulders tense. Vanessa perched on the edge of a velvet sofa, her nails drumming against her phone. They all looked up when Elena entered, carrying the 3 boxes. "We need to talk," Elena said. Marcus crossed his arms. "There's nothing to talk about. You have what you want. Power over us. Congratulations. That's not what I want." "Then what?" Vanessa snapped. "Money. An apology. What will it take for you to sign the damn papers and disappear again?" Elena set the boxes on the coffee table with a heavy thud. "I want you to understand," she said quietly. "Understand what?" Beatrice's voice was ice. "What you did. What you took from me." Beatrice stood, her glass trembling in her hand. "We took nothing. You were given money, support." "I was given silence," Elena interrupted. "I was given shame. I was told I didn't exist. You were a mistake." The words exploded from Beatrice like a wound bursting open. "You were the product of my husband's infidelity, and I did what I had to do to protect my family. I was a child." The simplicity of those words cut through the room like a blade. Elena stepped forward. "I was 10 years old when you came to my home. 10. And you looked at me like I was garbage. You threatened my grandmother. You erased me." "Your mother seduced. My mother was 22 years old," Elena said, her voice rising. "She was an employee. He was her employer. He had all the power, and you blamed her for it." Beatrice's face twisted. She knew he was married, and he knew it was wrong. Elena turned to Marcus and Vanessa. "You want to know what I found in those boxes? Letters, journals, financial records." She pulled out one of Clara's letters and held it up. "Your father loved my mother, really loved her. Not some sordid affair, not some momentary lapse, he loved her." Marcus's jaw tightened. "That's a lie. Read it yourself." Elena tossed the letter onto the table. "Read how she begged him to acknowledge me, how she died hoping he'd claim his daughter." Vanessa picked up the letter, her hands shaking. She read silently, her face going pale. "This doesn't change anything," Marcus said, but his voice had lost its edge. "No," Elena agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing changes what happened. But you need to hear it. You need to know what your perfect family was built on." She pulled out Richard's journal and opened it to a marked page. "July 22nd, 2003, she read aloud. "Elena's 18 today. I saw her at her high school graduation. I sat in the back, she didn't see me. She gave a speech about resilience, about building yourself when the world tries to tear you down. She's extraordinary, and I had nothing to do with it." Her voice cracked on the last sentence. She closed the journal and looked at them. He knew, he always knew, and he hated himself for it. Beatrice sank back into her chair, her face ashen. "Stop. Why? Because it hurts? Because it ruins the story you've been telling yourself? Because it doesn't matter?" Beatrice's composure finally shattered. "What's done is done. You can't undo 30 years. "No," Elena said softly. "I can't, but I can make you see it. Really see it. Not as something you swept under the rug, but as what it was. Cruelty. Deliberate cruelty." Vanessa stood abruptly. "You think you're so righteous, so noble, but you're enjoying this. You're enjoying making us squirm." "You're right," Elena said, and the honesty in her voice stopped Vanessa cold. "Part of me does enjoy it. Part of me wants you to feel a fraction of what I felt." She paused. "But that's not why I'm here." "Then why?" Marcus demanded. Elena looked at each of them in turn. "Because I need to decide if I'm going to let his guilt become my revenge." The room fell silent. "I have the power to destroy you," Elena continued, "to drag this out for years, to tie up the estate in legal battles, to tell the media everything and watch your perfect reputation crumble." Beatrice's hands were shaking. "But if I do that," Elena said, her voice breaking, "I become what you taught me I was. Nothing. A mistake. A wound that never heals." She picked up the boxes. "You have 2 days. I want each of you to write me a letter. Not an apology, not an excuse, just the truth, what you knew, what you chose, what you'd do differently." "And if we refuse," Marcus asked, "then I refuse to sign, and you get nothing." Elena walked to the door, then stopped. My mother died believing she didn't matter, that I didn't matter. I won't give you the satisfaction of being right. She left. Behind her, the Moore family sat in ruins, confronting the truth they'd spent decades avoiding. That night, Marcus sat in his bedroom, staring at a blank piece of paper. Dear Elena, he'd written that much, then stopped. What could he possibly say? The truth was he'd known. Not the details, not the extent, but he'd known there was someone, some shadow his father carried. He'd been 16 when he overheard his parents fighting, his mother screaming about that woman and that child, his father's voice low and defeated. She's innocent, Beatrice. Marcus had pretended not to hear. It was easier that way, easier to believe the lie, to accept the privilege without questioning its foundation. He'd built his entire identity on being Richard Moore's son, the heir, the chosen one. But what did that mean if his father had loved someone else's child more? Marcus crumpled the paper and started again. Vanessa stood on her balcony, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. She'd quit years ago, but tonight she needed something to do with her hands, something to calm the trembling. She'd read her mother's face during Elena's speech, seen the guilt, the fear, the shame, everything Vanessa had been taught to hide. Growing up, she'd been trained in the art of performance. Smile, wave, never let them see weakness. But Elena had walked in and ripped off the mask. Vanessa thought about the letter Elena had demanded, what you knew, what you chose. The truth was, Vanessa had never asked questions, never wanted to know, because knowing would mean complicity, and complicity would mean she was as guilty as her mother. Vanessa stubbed out the cigarette and went inside. She picked up a pen. Beatrice sat alone in the dark, the letter Elena had read still clutched in her hand. Please, don't let her think she was a mistake. Clara's final words. Beatrice had read this letter before, years ago, when Richard had left it on his desk. She'd read it, felt a momentary pang of something like guilt, and then buried it again, because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging everything, that Richard had loved Clara, that Elena had deserved better, that Beatrice, in her desperate need to protect her pride, had destroyed an innocent child's life. She told herself it was necessary, that she was protecting her children, her family, her legacy, but the truth, the one she'd spent decades running from, was simpler. She'd been jealous, not of Clara's beauty, not of her youth, of the way Richard had looked at her with love, real unguarded love, the kind of love he'd never shown Beatrice. Their marriage had been a transaction, wealth plus status equals dynasty, but Clara had been chosen, and Beatrice couldn't forgive that. She stood slowly, her body heavy with years of rage and regret. She picked up a pen. For the first time in 30 years, Beatrice Moore decided to tell the truth. 2 days later, Elena returned to the Moore estate. Jonathan Whitmore met her at the door, holding a manila envelope. They wrote the letters, he said quietly, all 3 of them. Elena took the envelope, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. There's something else, Whitmore continued. Your father left you a video message, recorded a week before he died. Elena's breath caught. A video? He asked me not to show it to you unless you came back, unless you stayed. Where is it? Whitmore led her back to Richard's study. A laptop sat open on the desk, a single video file on the screen. I'll leave you alone, Whitmore said. He closed the door softly behind him. Elena sat in her father's chair and stared at the play button. Her finger hovered over the mouse. Do I want to hear this? After 30 years of silence, did his voice even matter? She clicked play. The screen flickered. Richard Moore appeared, sitting in this very chair, in this very room. He looked old, sick. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, but his gaze was clear. He looked directly into the camera, directly at her. Elena. His voice was rough, weaker than she'd imagined. I don't know if you'll watch this. I don't know if you'll even come, but if you're seeing this, it means you did, and I need you to know the truth. He paused, gathering strength. I loved your mother. The words hung in the air. Not the way they'll tell you. Not some affair, not some mistake. I loved her, completely. And when she told me she was pregnant with you, I was terrified. He looked down, his hands trembling. I had a life already, a wife, children, responsibilities. And your mother, she had nothing. No power, no protection, just love. His voice cracked. I made a choice, a coward's choice. I decided to hide you both, to pay for your care but never claim you, to love you from a distance where it couldn't hurt me. He looked back at the camera. But it did hurt. Every day, every birthday I missed, Every milestone I watched from the shadows, it killed me slowly. A tear ran down his face. When your mother died, I wanted to bring you home, raise you myself. But Beatrice was right. I'd built a house on lies, and bringing you into it would have collapsed everything. He wiped his face roughly. So I let you go. Again. And I've regretted it every day since. He leaned forward, his eyes fierce despite his weakness. You deserved better. You deserved a father who was brave enough to choose you, who was willing to face the consequences of his love. His voice dropped to a whisper. I wasn't that man. I was a coward, and I'm sorry. He paused, breathing heavily. I know this doesn't fix anything. I know you probably hate me. You have every right to. He smiled, sad and broken. But I need you to know, you were never a mistake. You were the best thing I ever created. And the fact that I wasn't there to tell you that every day is the greatest failure of my life. He reached toward the camera, as if he could touch her through the screen. I love you, Elena. I always have. And I hope someday you'll believe that. The video ended. Elena sat in the darkness, tears streaming down her face. All her life she'd imagined this moment, imagined what she'd feel if he ever acknowledged her. She'd thought she'd feel vindicated, triumphant, whole. Instead, she just felt tired and heartbroken. For the child she'd been, for the father she'd never had, for the love that had existed but never been enough. She cried until there was nothing left. Then she opened the letters. Marcus's letter was clinical, precise, like a legal document. Elena, I knew you existed. Not the details, but the shadow of you. I was 16 when I overheard my parents fighting about you. I could have asked questions, demanded the truth, but I didn't. I chose ignorance because it was easier, because acknowledging you would have complicated my life. I told myself I was innocent, that it wasn't my fault, that I was just a kid. But I stopped being a kid years ago, and I still chose not to find you. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it. But you deserve the truth. I knew, and I did nothing. Marcus. Elena set it aside, feeling a strange mix of anger and pity. Vanessa's letter was messier, more emotional, the handwriting shaky. Elena, I don't know what to say. I've spent my whole life pretending to be perfect, pretending our family was perfect. I knew about you the same way I knew about all our other dirty secrets. I just never looked directly at them. My mother raised me to believe that image was everything, that what people thought of us mattered more than what we actually were. So I performed. I smiled. I pretended. And when you showed up, I hated you, not because of who you are, but because you forced me to see what we really are. Liars, cowards, people who valued comfort over conscience. I'm sorry, for what that's worth. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I didn't deserve the life I got. Vanessa. Elena felt her chest tighten. She'd expected defensiveness, excuses, not this raw, ugly honesty. She saved Beatrice's letter for last. It was written on expensive stationery, the handwriting elegant but unsteady. Elena, you asked for truth. Here it is. I hated you before you were born, not because of who you were, but because of what you represented. Your mother had something I never did. My husband's love. Our marriage was arranged, practical, strategic. I knew Richard didn't love me the way wives dream of being loved, but I thought that didn't matter. I thought loyalty and duty were enough. Then Clara came into our lives, and I watched my husband fall in love for the first time, with someone else. When she got pregnant, I saw an opportunity to assert control, to punish them both, to prove I was the one with power, so I made him choose. Me or her, the family or the affair. He chose me, or rather, he chose his reputation. But even after she died, even after you were gone, I could never shake the feeling that I'd won nothing, because every time Richard looked at me, I saw regret in his eyes. You want to know if I'd do things differently? Yes, I would. Not because you deserved better, though you did, but because hatred is exhausting, and I've been exhausted for 30 years. I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back your childhood. But I can tell you this, you won. Not because of the will, not because you have power over us, but because you survived. You became someone without our name, without our help. You proved you didn't need us. And that's the thing I couldn't stand to admit. You were always better than us. Beatrice Moore. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. She felt no satisfaction, no victory, just the overwhelming weight of 3 decades of pain finally acknowledged. She folded the letters carefully and placed them back in the envelope. Then she pulled out her phone and called Jonathan Whitmore. I've made my decision, she said. The Moore family assembled in the drawing room one final time. They sat in silence, waiting. The door opened. Elena walked in, followed by Jonathan Whitmore. She carried a single folder. Marcus stood. "Have you decided?" "Yes." The room held its breath. Elena opened the folder and pulled out a document. "I'm signing the release," she said. "The estate will be distributed as originally planned." Vanessa's eyes widened. "You are?" "With one condition." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What condition?" Elena looked at each of them. 50% of my father's liquid assets will be placed in a trust. That trust will fund a foundation in my mother's name, the Clara Santos Foundation. She pulled out a second document. It will provide support for children of single mothers, scholarships, legal aid, resources for kids who've been erased, hidden, or told they don't matter. Beatrice closed her eyes. The remaining 50% will be divided among the three of you as executors of the foundation. You'll manage it. You'll ensure it does good. And if we refuse? Marcus asked quietly. Then I tie up the estate for years, and you get nothing. She set the papers on the table. But I don't think you'll refuse. Vanessa picked up the documents, scanning them. Why? Why are you doing this? Elena met her eyes. Because my mother taught me that cruelty is a choice, and so is grace. She looked at Beatrice. You took everything from me, my father, my name, my chance to belong. Beatrice's face crumpled. But if I spend the rest of my life hating you, I give you even more. I give you my future. Elena's voice was steady, strong. So I'm choosing something else, not forgiveness exactly, not forgetting, but release. She picked up a pen and signed her name on the release form. I'm letting you go, and I'm letting myself be free. She handed the pen to Marcus. Your turn. Marcus stared at the pen in his hand. His entire life he'd been taught that power meant control, that winning meant dominating. But Elena had just shown him a different kind of power, the power to choose mercy over revenge. He signed. Vanessa signed next, tears streaming down her face. Finally, Beatrice stood. She walked to the table slowly, her movements stiff and painful. She picked up the pen, her hand shaking. I don't deserve this, she whispered. No, Elena agreed. You don't, but my mother did, and this is for her. Beatrice signed, the pen trembling across the page. When she finished, she looked at Elena. Thank you. Elena didn't respond. She simply nodded. Jonathan Whitmore gathered the documents. It's done, the estate is settled. Elena turned to leave. Wait. Beatrice's voice stopped her. Elena looked back. Beatrice stood, her mask finally gone, her face naked with grief. I'm sorry, she said simply, for all of it. Elena studied her for a long moment. I know. It wasn't forgiveness. Not quite. But it was acknowledgement. And sometimes that's all there is. Elena walked out of the Moore estate for the last time. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. She stood at the gates and looked back at the house. For 30 years, it had been a symbol of everything she'd lost. Now, it was just a building. Beautiful. Empty. Irrelevant. She pulled out her phone and made a call. Sarah, it's Elena. Yeah, I'm done. No, I'm good. Actually, I'm better than good. Listen, I need your help with something. I'm starting a foundation. She walked down the long driveway, her voice steady, her steps light. Behind her, the Moore family sat in their mansion, wealthy and powerful. But Elena had something they'd never have, freedom. She'd walked into their world as the bastard the father never claimed, and she'd walked out as the woman who'd claimed herself. 3 years later, the Clara Santos Foundation had grown beyond anything Elena had imagined. They'd helped 200 children, provided scholarships to 50 students, funded legal battles for families torn apart by poverty and stigma. Elena stood at the podium of the Foundation's annual gala, looking out at a room full of donors, volunteers, and the children they'd helped. Among the crowd in the back sat 3 figures, Marcus, Vanessa, and Beatrice Moore. They came to every gala, never at the center, never demanding attention, just there, present, doing the work. Marcus had stepped down from Moore Industries to run the foundation full-time. Vanessa used her social connections to raise millions. Beatrice volunteered in the after-school programs, reading to children who reminded her of the child she'd tried to erase. They didn't do it for redemption. They did it because Elena had shown them that some debts can only be paid forward. After the gala, Elena found Beatrice sitting alone in the garden. The older woman looked smaller now. Age and regret had worn her down. You should be inside, Elena said gently. People want to thank you. Beatrice shook her head. I'm not the one they should thank. Elena sat beside her. They sat in silence for a long moment. Do you ever think about her? Beatrice asked quietly. Your mother. Every day. What do you think she'd say about all this? Elena considered. I think she'd say she told me so. Beatrice looked at her, confused. She used to tell me, Elena continued, that the best revenge is a life well lived. That the people who hurt you don't deserve your hatred. They deserve to be irrelevant. She smiled softly. But you're not irrelevant anymore. You're helpful. And I think she'd like that better. Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve your grace. No, Elena agreed. But you're getting it anyway, because I'm not doing this for you. She stood. I'm doing it for every kid who feels like they don't belong, who's been told they're a mistake, who thinks their pain defines them. She looked down at Beatrice. I'm showing them that it doesn't, that you can survive, that you can build something beautiful from something broken. She walked away, leaving Beatrice alone with her tears and her transformation. That night, Elena returned to her apartment, still modest, still small, still home. She made tea and sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. On her desk sat a framed photograph, the only one she had of her mother, Clara, young and smiling, holding baby Elena in her arms. I did it, Mom, Elena whispered. I made them see, and then I let them go. She thought about her father's video, his confession, his regret. She'd watched it only once more since that day, and then she'd saved it, filed it away, not to forget, but to remember that even powerful men are, in the end, just broken humans. Richard Moore had loved her. In his own cowardly, insufficient way, he'd loved her. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. And Elena had learned that sometimes something is all we get. The phone rang. Elena picked it up. Elena Santos. Ms. Santos, this is Rebecca from County Social Services. We have a situation. A 10-year-old girl, father unknown, mother recently passed. She's been placed in temporary custody, but she needs long-term support. I thought of the foundation. Elena grabbed a pen. Tell me everything. As she listened, taking notes, making plans, mobilizing resources, Elena felt something settle in her chest. Purpose. She'd been erased, hidden, told she didn't exist, and she'd used that pain to make sure other children would be seen. That was the victory. Not power over her family, not revenge, but transformation. She'd taken the silence they'd forced on her and filled it with voices. She'd taken the erasure and made it into acknowledgement. She'd taken the bastard they'd hidden and made her into a builder. 5 years after that, Elena stood at her mother's grave. She came every year on Clara's birthday, bringing fresh flowers and quiet gratitude. The headstone was simple. Clara Santos, beloved mother, 1972, 1995. Elena had added a new line beneath it, carved fresh into the stone. Her love built what their pride could not destroy. She knelt and placed the flowers gently. Hey, Mom, I brought your favorites. Yellow roses. She sat in the grass, speaking softly. The foundation helped its 1,000th child this month. Can you believe that? 1,000 kids who know they matter. She smiled. Marcus got engaged. To a teacher, actually. Someone real, someone kind. I think you'd like her. Vanessa's in therapy, really working on herself. She asked if I'd have coffee with her next week, just us, no agenda. And Beatrice is dying. Cancer. She asked to see me last week. Eleanor's voice caught. She wanted to apologize again. I told her she didn't have to, that I'd heard her the first time. She wiped her eyes. She held my hand, and she said, "Thank you for letting me do something good before I go." Elena looked up at the sky. I don't know if forgiveness is real, Mom. I don't know if wounds ever fully heal, but I know this. I'm happy, despite everything, because of everything. I built a life, a real one, and nobody can take that from me. She stood, touching the headstone gently. I love you, Mom, and I'm living the life you wanted for me, a free one. She walked away from the grave, into the sunlight, into the future she'd built from ashes and refusal. The bastard the father never claimed had become the woman nobody could deny, and in the end that was the only inheritance that mattered.